together. Now, he starts this with the idea of the spirit blessings are in the spiritual realm. All the blessings that are in the spiritual realm are from God. And he elevates us to quit thinking about the physical, to always thinking about our spiritual relationships to God and to each other. And that's part of the key of our being one. So I think it's a significant challenge that Paul has laid for us here in the book of Ephesians. Challenge that I am going, as he talks about putting off the old self and putting on the new self. We're going to look at putting on the armor of God. We're going to grow up into the image of God, the likeness of God. That's a significant challenge. I find for myself. I don't know about the rest of you. Those are some glorious challenges he's given us. Well, I think what we have here in 10 through 17 is a very specific assurance or a way that we can make this transformation in our lives. It's not going to be by the futility of my mind or the futility of your mind. It's going to be by adopting what God uses for his own nature. And I want us to think about that. We talk about, he's going to talk about the putting on the armor of God. There's two ways you can look at the thought of the armor of God. One is God made this armor and shipped it down here for us to put on. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is these are the very qualities that God himself wears. This is his armor. This is what makes him holy. This is what keeps him from being overcome by the devil. We're talking about the war between God and Satan. It's real. You know, Peter talks about the devil's roaring around and goes about seeking whom he can devour. He's in opposition to God as much more so than he is to us. So God has his defenses. He has his armor that protects him from Satan. And I think we need to think of it. And that's what I think he is suggesting. Not that we're ever he's going to wear the armor in the same way we do, but there are these things, these qualities, this nature of God that keeps him from being overcome by Satan. We need to put these same armor qualities on ourselves, I think is the idea. And I kind of get that idea from Isaiah. I want to turn back to Isaiah, the 59th chapter. Isaiah introduces this idea of God wearing armor. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that before. I never envisioned of God wearing armor. But this is the picture that he gives us in Isaiah 59. And I'm going to begin in verse. I think I wrote that. No, here it is. Yeah, verse 16 or 15. In Isaiah 59, Isaiah is talking about Israel. And we know that Israel was to be the army of God, right? They were to be the nation of God, and they were to live for God and be devoted to God. But we know that Israel failed in that. They were not successful in having the image of God and fighting really against Satan in this life. In the middle of verse 15, he says, now the Lord saw, and it was displeasing in his sight, there was no justice. He's talking about in Israel. There was nobody living like God. And he saw, and there was no man, and was astonished, and there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought about salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. He put on righteousness like a breastplate, and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself with zeal as a mantle, according to their deeds. So he will repay wrath to his adversaries and recompense to his enemies. To the coastlands, he will make recompense. So he will fear the name for they will fear the name of the Lord from the west, and his glory from the rising of the sun. For he will come like a rushing stream, which the wind of the Lord drives. A Redeemer will come to Zion, and to those who turn from transgression in Jacob, declares the Lord. What I want us to see from this, there's a lot in that we're not going to cover, but I want us to see God clothes himself with an armor. He prepares for a battle. And some of the description of the armor, it talks about that he put on righteousness. He has a helmet of salvation. He puts on garments of vengeance to wrap himself in zeal as a mantle. So the picture is God, and I don't want us to focus so much on the physical concepts of the armor, but it's focused on what God really put on. He put on righteousness. He put on salvation. He put on zeal for that which is right. And because God had this as his qualities or his nature, Satan could not overcome him or defeat him in battle. That was God's nature. And so I think this is what we have over here in Ephesians, back in the 5th chapter now. God's going to be talking about putting on an armor. It's putting on the very nature of God, the very qualities that he has that keep Satan from overcoming him. Now, obviously, God is infinite in all of his qualities. And we're not infinite in our qualities. We need to grow up toward him. But see, as we put these qualities on, that we can have the defense that we need to be the Christian that we need to be. And then Satan will not overcome us. So his statement here in chapter 6 and verse 10 of Ephesians is, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Where are we going to be strong? Our thinking or in the Lord, in the likeness of God? That's the conclusion to everything Paul has said here, I think, in the book. If we're going to be successful in making these transformations in our lives, we're going to have to be strong in the Lord and not look to anything else. I think it's his first admonition. And then he begins to enumerate, I think the idea of the strength of his might. We can never overstate or overestimate the strength of God. Back in the first chapter, in verse 19 and 20, he talks about the strength of God's might. And he says, what is the surpassing greatness of his power toward us who believe? That is in accordance with the working of the strength of his might, which he brought about in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in heavenly places. So God has demonstrated his surpassing power, his surpassing strength, and he brought Jesus from the dead to the spiritual heavenlies and seated him at his right hand. That is a measure of the strength of the might of God. He's saying here, we've got to be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. We've got to tap into that strength from God. We're not going to make it on our own. That we move from dead to alive. I think that's his first point. We have to admit we're not going to do it on our own. We've got to join ourselves to his strength, to his power. Now, our problem, of course, I'm preaching rather than going through the lecture, is we waffle around, right? I want to do this, I want to do that, and all these things, rather than listening to what he said and tapping into that. And so he says, finally, stand in the Lord and his strength, and then you'll make these changes in your life. You'll make this transformation. Then he's talked about the putting on the armor. These are and I want us to look at these from the perspective that these are things, not just comparing, and sometimes we look at this section, we talk about the how these various things, like the breastplate and how they protect, and they're similar to I think that's his comparison in a sense, but let's not get down to the details so much that we miss the function or the purpose of this things that God is supplying us with, how these help us. So to put on the full armor of God so you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. 1 Peter 5:8 talks about the devil's roaring lion seeking who he may devour. In verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. In chapter 1 of verse 3, we had all the spiritual blessings coming from heavenly places that God, the spiritual realm, God providing to all heavenly places. Here in the spiritual realm, there is this opposing force, and this opposing force, the principalities and powers, all are represented by Satan and his associates. They're opposing righteousness. The first picture of that in the Bible was where? Garden of Eden, right? That's the very first picture we have of this conflict is in the Garden of Eden. And we see it all the way up to the flood. We see it all through Israel. We see it all through the Old Testament, these opposing forces, God and Satan. Well, it is true. It's real in your life. So our battle, and I think this is really significant for me and for you, is particularly thinking about our relationships. Generally, the things that we battle about in our relationships, and I'll just pick as husbands and wife, is how much money we have to spend, or who gets to go where, or where we're going to eat, and all those sort of things. Those are all the physical things of life. And Paul's saying that's not our battle. Quit fighting that physical battle. And that will help our relationships. We'll quit fighting the physical battle and move to the spiritual battle, which is to help each of us become like God. And I think that's his thought here. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, whether it be in relationships and everything in our life. Our struggle is against the temptations of Satan to separate us from God. Now, I'll stop right there and see if you've got any thoughts before we start looking at the kind of the armor. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, go back to chapter 1 and verse 3. So we have all the spiritual blessings from the heavenly, some says heavenly, some translations use heavenly realms, heavenly places, some places just say the heavenlies. And so we have the spiritual realm, I think is what he's talking. God, the spiritual realm, God is there. He can provide us with blessings. We learn here and as other places, there's also opposing forces in the spiritual realm. I think the heavenlies mean the spiritual realm in heavenly places. Let's don't think about, sometimes we think about heavenly as God's throne only. But there is a spiritual realm where God is definitely the center of that realm. His throne is in control of that realm. But Satan and his followers who rebelled against God are also in that realm. And that's the forces I think he's talking about there. It's not something that's confined to the earth or fleshly. That's not our struggle, which we many times we think it is. Does that help any, or others got some comments here? Dempsey?
Yeah, as you pointed out, and can't save ourselves.
Right.
So, as I see it, saying chapter 4, 5, and 6, especially 6, is you can't stay saved by yourself.
Right.
It's not, I'm saying, I got this stuff. I'll take it from here. We must fight the good fight of faith. But God provides all the armor. We're not going to stay safe unless we stay in prayer. We have to stay on our element. We've got to stay on our element. God is saying, you know, if you take a fish out of water, he's going to die. He's out of his element. He's fine in the element. If you take him out, he's going to die. Take that plant out of the ground, it's going to die because it's out of its element. When you take a Christian out of God's word, out of prayer, out of fellowship, he's going to die. He's out of his element.
Okay. And I want us to think about, he says, this is not a fleshly battle. Now, if it was a fleshly battle, money could play a part. Physical strength could play a part. In personal intelligence could play a part if it were a physical battle. But what value are any of those in fighting against Satan? They're not. And I think that's what that's the point he's trying to make to us there. You and I don't have the resources in ourselves to enter this conflict with Satan. There's a lot I don't understand about what's in the spiritual realm, but there is a group under Satan that's referred to here that is in opposition to God and are serving God.
You might as well take it whether or not so it doesn't bother.
Yeah. Right. And so that's his, I think that's his first point. Yes, Jerry. Right. Well, I agree with you there. And so I think his first point here in these first, down through verse 12 is, there is more than just what you can see with your eyes. More than just what is around you physically that is in opposition to you and me. And we are not going to, by our physical strength, money, intelligence, or whatever, how we measure physical strength, we're not going to be able to stand against that. And that is why I believe many Christians fall away and lose their faith. They're trying to do it on their own. Some will get done this morning, so I can't preach a whole lesson here. But that's the importance of now looking at these qualities that God has as his armor, and he gives these qualities for us to put on as our armor that will help us to stand. So I just want to quickly go through these things and just kind of introduce this idea to you this morning and let us think about it. And so some of the thing we'll put on is put on the full armor of God, you may be able to resist in the evil day, having done everything to stand firm. So Paul is truly anticipating that this group of Christians he's writing to, he's supplying them with the method of not falling away. You hear what I said? He's supplying them with a method, the avenue to not fall away if they will do because he's getting these things from God. He's not depending on himself, just like he was saved by grace from God. Now he's going to stay with God by the tools that God gives him rather than his own forces. He uses in verse 13, he will be able to resist in the evil day. Let's think about a moment of just the evil day. To me, that comes back from chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as the unwise, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. The life we're living in, the days are evil. Evil is there. So I think what he's reflecting on the idea here in verse 13. Now you're going to have this evil day. That's today. You're going to face with the evil day. How are you going to make it today in this evil day? He's talked about all the days are evil. This evil day, this situation we're in now. How we're going to be able to resist Satan's temptations and stay with God in this evil day. I don't think he's looking at some specific day, but our days as individuals. Okay, then he says, stand firm. I don't know how many times he says stand in this. Stay with God. Don't be moved. Stay where you are. And here's how we're going to stand firm. Having girded your loins with truth. Wasn't that the conversation that Jesus had? He was asked, what is truth? There is a truth. There's a truth about God. There's a truth about his nature. We've got to take that truth and make that a part of our hearts and our lives, the truth of God. He exists. He's all-knowing. There's going to be a judgment. Those things are true. And so I think we're not going to stand unless we understand the truth. If we believe a lie, we can wander anywhere. But stand in the truth, knowing God, who he is, and his nature. And so does God know that? That's why I say these actually are qualities of God that makes him who he is. And he's able to stand because of who he is. He knows the truth about the nature of himself and the universe and all life. And he's not going to be in any way dissuaded or deceived in that. We've got to put on the truth that comes from God. The second thing in this, he says, put on the breastplate of righteousness. What is righteousness? It's living by the truth, right? Once we learn what the truth is, we live by that. We devote ourselves to it. And so we've got to know the truth, devote ourselves to it, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. What's the preparation of the gospel of peace? That's what he wants us to put on here. How does the gospel prepare you to peace? What he's saying? The gospel has prepared us for peace with God through our recognizing we're sinners, confessing that we're sinners, and redemption is in Christ Jesus. That's the preparation of the gospel. Isn't that what we try to share with everyone? So we have to always reflect on how we were prepared to be children of God by this gospel of peace. It's not by my strength. What do you say back over here? Christ, by the grace of God, we're redeemed through Christ. That's one of the blessings from God. That's the preparation of the gospel. It's not that we just read the gospel. We understand how that has changed us and how that has plays or effect in our lives. So that's the third thing that we need to understand. First, understand what is true. Start practicing truth, and then remembering where we were and where we are, how we were changed and prepared to be God's servants by his teaching. Other thoughts here? Excuse me. In verse 16, it says, in addition to all taking up the shield of faith, which were able to extinguish or to quench all the fiery darts of the evil one. I think that is probably to me the most appropriate visual of there, the most to me inspiring visual of this group of armor here, is that we've got this battle with the spiritual forces. Satan is the leader of that. And what's he doing? He's shooting flame arrows at us. Now, that was a pretty common war tactic in the time of the day of the writing of the, it'd be some kind of laser beam now if we were writing it today, but flaming arrows, and that, the problem with that is either they might catch you on fire, or your protection, the building you're in, or if you were in the brush, you might catch it on fire. That was one of the most deadly and dangerous things in warfare. And you got the idea of the shield that you could knock it away, keep it from penetrating or coming to you. That's the place of faith in God in our lives. If we truly trust in God, what are the flaming arrows in our life? What are the flaming arrows Satan throws at us? Pardon? Okay. Okay, things that are more important than God. That's a flaming arrow, right? This is something that's more important than God. Get involved in it. Okay, that's a good thought. Some other flaming arrows.
But Satan will use whatever means possible to try to get in the heart. You have to have the word of God constantly alert, sober. Peter will say, sober, alert, always aware of tricks and tricks. He's a schemer. Oh, we use that word. He's a schemer. He has a strategy. He looks at every individual. He's pretty good at it. Been at it a long time. He has a strategy for every single person, how to get into that heart and build foothold, establish the foothold. So does God. God has strategy also. And so we must accept and trust God's strategy. Because God can trust him always to be strong. God is strong. Right? So I always trust the Lord. But, there's so many idols in this world. Read books, all associations, and you have to be very, very careful with some of those thoughts. You have to know.
Okay. And so a flaming arrow could be anything that is contrary to that truth that we started with. God's truth. Anything that attacks that and causes to diminish our confidence in God for that. Now, our faith in God has to be the thing that stops doubt from growing. And the flaming arrow is going to produce doubt. Maybe God didn't understand your situation in this, and you get a buy on this. You ever felt that way? I get an exception on this idea or that. Well, keeping faith in God and not allowing false ideas to penetrate your heart, because you know God knows best. Now, as Dempsey said, you have to understand the truth. We have to understand the truth, know the truth, but then trust. That faith in God, that trust in God is that this is the whole truth, all the truth, and nothing is going to supplant that. That's a place of faith. That when we start doubting that God has revealed all we need to know, or what he has revealed is the truth, then we're going to fall. That is, and so that I think that's important for us. And then finally, he says, take the helmet of, yes, Mike.
There's another dimension of that as well. Satan tempts us, and that's the main thing we worry about Satan doing to Christians, is it's trying to get us to turn away from God. But a lot of what Christians are doing, particularly at this time, are things against the body, and things against their personal life. And Satan is think about all those Christians that were martyred during the persecution. You know, Satan is behind that, and that's a plain arrow he's throwing at people when they're in prison, and they're waiting to be thrown to the lions or whatever martyrdom that they're going to face. It's their faith that causes them not to lose hope.
Right. And that's the idea of the shield of faith. That's going to keep you with God, because these things are coming at me, whether it be a temptation or it be a potential death even. If these things are coming at me, I trust God. Here's what he said. I understand that. I'm not going to let it waver. When we fall away is when we allow something. It might not be as extreme as being our life threatened, but it's the things that we would want to do or we're tempted to do. And we've just figured, well, it'd be better if it was that way. And we began to doubt that God has given us, God would want me to be happy. Is one of the biggest faith killers in the world. That reasoning or thinking, oh, God wants me to be like him. And ultimately, I will be happy and blessed. And so I think that's trusting God in the face of all those things. Then the final one down there in that group is the helmet of salvation. What is salvation? Well, it's being with God. That is our hope. Salvation is our hope. That's the thing. It's interesting. He doesn't use the word hope in this section here, but hope is the greatest motivator in all of life, is hope. And salvation is our hope. Keep your hope in God. Trust God and keep hoping in him, and you'll stay with him. And you'll grow up into his image, I think is the idea in this. And so these things are qualities, they're attributes that if we can build into ourselves, we will grow up into the image of God. And these are the tools that God have given us. None of them originated with us. They don't come from within, they come from God. And we have to, and so that's what Paul's saying finally here. If you're going to be this person, this a new person, then put these qualities on and let them rule your life, not your selfish interest. That's really what he's saying here. And so it's not going to come from us. I have a few more things I'd like to share, but I'm going to go ahead and finish up this morning. He talks about this prayer in the Spirit down here in verse 18. He finishes that admonition with the idea of prayer. And he talks about prayer in the Spirit. I do think, again, he, as he has done many times in this book, he's contrasted the physical realm, flesh, he calls it flesh and blood, with the heavenly or spiritual realm. Our prayers have got to be focused on the spiritual realm. For these spiritual tools that God's supplying us, that's where our prayers need to be focused. Not that we don't have struggles with physical things, but our prayer has to be focused there if we're going to be successful. He talks about Tychicus, the one who's going to be bringing this, who's a great servant of God in the latter part of his salutation here, but I'm going to finish with that. Y'all sit down now. I did want us to look at this armor and how these qualities are essential if we're going to stay faithful to God. And it's his armor. It's the very nature that he has that keeps him being who he is. Thank you.